Welcome back to another episode of Chat with Will Grant. I am super duper excited to introduce you guys to our newest guest, Tony Riddle, aka the Natural Lifestylist. He is a coach, a father, a husband, an author, and also a record-breaking barefoot endurance athlete. He's inspired me in many different ways, from following his social media to listening and watching a lot of the interviews he's done online. I believe I first found out about Tony through the interview he did with Rich Roll, where he was talking about the benefits of being barefoot and how he actually got rid of most or all of the chairs and couches in his house and how he ground lives. And then that brought me to his YouTube channel, where he explains so much in depth with movement, breath work, just how to bring our minds and bodies back to the natural state of being and connect us back with nature. So it just made so much sense for us to connect. And I'm really excited to introduce you guys to Tony Riddle. How's everything going over there in England, Tony?
It's great, man. Well, firstly, Will, thanks for having me on, man. What an intro, huh?
Yeah, man, I've been practicing my intros, man. I hope it's getting better. You know, I know
it's smooth. It's smooth. It's nice, huh? I like it. It saves me from going through a big intro of, I'm Tony Riddle, aka the Natural Lifestylist, and it sounds like a big sell, So
yeah, exactly. I remember I did an interview one time, and the interview, or it was for a podcast, actually, probably the biggest podcast I ever done. And they first started out, they said, "All right, this is Will Grant. Will Grant, who are you?" And I'm just like, man, I'm trying to figure out this myself, and I got to tell everybody else. So yeah, man, I'm so excited.
When you get asked to tell your story, so tell us about your story, how you got to where you are now. It's like, well, I'm 46. It's like 46 years of work has gone into me being sitting here right now, and even in the next breath, I'm a different Tony. It's kind of
yeah, exactly. So were you born and raised in a similar place where you're living now, or have you moved around? Or
we've pretty much moved around. I was born in a town called Thatcham, which was just in the countryside. And then my parents moved. They thought it was a wise move to move into a village because my dad's business that he was working at was that way. But it meant, we suddenly moved into quite a grey, concrete kind of existence, not much green land around it,
Yeah.
And then, we've moved around a fair bit. We're now in Somerset. We've been quite nomadic for a period of time now. So we were in London, then we moved to Ibiza for a bit, and then we came back from Ibiza back to London, then to Somerset, and then we've just been, and then we've landed back in Somerset. So that's kind of West Country, and it's we're in the countryside again now. So you might hear the odd tractor kind of going past.
Yeah, that's cool. And you're a father of a couple beautiful girls, or how many daughters do you have, or how many kids do you have?
3 daughters and 1 son. So
yeah,
3 kids now. So
3 daughters and 1 son.
Amazing ages. So you really get to see kind of there's always the dynamics already they're always changing. But like one's about to turn 12, one about to turn 10. We have a 5-year-old and an 18-month-old boy who's just learning from the girls at the moment. So he's accelerated, really, I would say, in his learning. And the good news is, because of what we do, and we natural parent, and we try and weave our lifestyles more naturally, that what is absorbing or observing in our habitat is more of a biological norm. Doesn't mean it's the social norm of today, but it's more of a natural norm.
Just to explain to the viewers a little bit, what are some things that you do differently that most people think are a bit out of the norm, as far as in your household, how you set up your house, and even the way that you raise your kids?
Well, that conversation's changed, because if I go back 10 years ago when I really started let's saw up the furniture, put it up on YouTube, I'm getting rid of the couch and the chairs, and people were like, this guy's nuts. And now I'm getting tagged all over the place with hashtags. Yeah, we've removed the chairs from our home. We heard you and it's amazing. And people really seeing the benefit of that. So that's one thing, is that we ground live, we chair live. We ground live rather than chair live, sorry. That includes the way we sleep, kind of beddings on the ground. So that removes what is compromising, I would say, the modern posture of today, the sitting culture.
Tell us a bit why chairs or why couches are compromising our posture, or what were the reasons, because it's funny that you say that, because here I am sitting on the ground, here's my bed on the ground as well. And that's a huge part inspired from you, but it was around the same time that I fell into your teachings that I was going through a lot of injuries. And I noticed immediately that the more I was on the ground, the better my knee felt, the better my back felt, and the better my body felt. And the more that I was sitting on couches, it almost felt like it was molding me into these bad movement patterns that I was doing throughout the day. So when I came across your teachings, I just said, all right, let me spend more time on the ground. And sure enough, the more time I spent on the ground, the better my body felt when I was at a time where I was really, really injured. So explain a little bit why you got rid of the chairs, or how that does compromise your posture.
Yeah, well, there's loads of entries on this, but I'll start with, I come from more of a rehab background. So I had a Pilates studio, rehab Pilates, very prescriptive. And people would arrive, and I had practitioners working for me, and reformers set up, and all this amazing equipment that Joseph Pilates basically used his kind of mind to create. And it was all postural awareness. But when that was designed, we're talking about a different era to where we are now, right? So, and most of his clients, because his first studio was above the New York City Ballet, most of the repertoire of movement was designed for people that were in dance, right? Who had a dance background. And here my clients are rocking up, they'd drive to the studio, they'd be in what I class now as compromising footwear, huge amounts of rubber, disconnecting them from where their muscles and their tendons and bone structures are in their feet, which then alters the way their ankles, knees, and hips behave. Sitting in a car that alters the way their hips behave and the way their posture should be related to their feet. And then they'd leave their shoes at the door, come in, and we'd be rehabbing on a reformer,
You just broke up, and I actually missed the last few sentences that you said.
Should we go again?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, so going back, so I had a Pilates studio, and my main practice is about rehabilitating people. They'd come in, it could be back problems or knee problems or neck problems, something that would be created in what I class as the human zoo, right? Some kind of zoo behavior rather than natural behavior. So they'd rock up, and they'd be driving to the studio, sitting in a car. They'd get out of the car, they'd walk from the car to the studio, they'd leave their footwear that's more often not very narrow in the toe box and quite wide in the heel, which is the opposite shape to a foot. They'd leave the footwear there, they'd come in, and I'd be treating them for mechanical low back pain, knee problems, or neck problems. And then it's all symptom relief. And I'd be seeing, like, everyone's coming in with the same stuff, man, what's going on? And around that time, met this genius called Dr. Romanoff, who was Nicholas Romanoff, and he developed something called the pose method. And the pose method, he was a track and field coach in the Soviet era. Back then, they were like film stars, they were trying to breed these superhumans, right? And he discovered when people were running that they all went to a specific posture when they ran. And so it's like, okay, so they go from that posture to that posture in the shortest time, spend the least amount of time on the ground. That minimizes injury and it improves efficiency, right? So when you take that template, you say, well, where does that exist? Well, it exists in nature. This is how natural running hunter-gatherers or indigenous people run, right? They have a great posture. They run pretty much the same. So what is it they're doing? What's different in their habitat? And when you start to break it down, you can see fundamentally there's no rubberized, compromising, narrow footwear, and there was no chairs, right? So then it started to, I started to kind of unravel a bit. And I ended up closing my studio. It just become one of those points where you can't honestly keep treating people for conditions that are it's just symptom relief. Let's go to the cause. And that's where it first came in. Then arriving at home was like, wow, I can't exactly have my kids sitting in chairs. I know all this. I'm treating people daily, so it has to happen at this level. It's about being the change, right? So we have to take and adopt those behaviors for others to observe. That was the first step. And then, then various studies. And I always since then, I've been looking to ways of living that are more in sync with human biology and natural norms. And where do we go for that? Well, it's the same place as looking for where do people run naturally? Well, it's in nature. And how do people sit in nature? And you see the best studies are really done recently on the Hadza. Now, they're just as sedentary as we are, right? So they sit for 10.5 hours a day, right? Which is kind of the average kind of, I guess, office dweller right now, or the average urbanite spends probably more.
They'll work for 8 hours while they're sitting, and then they go home and they sit.
Yeah, and they get on the public transport, sit, or in their car, sit, or if you're traveling anywhere, it's all sitting. Out to dine, sitting. So what is it they're doing? Well, they exist on the ground. So it's like there's this number of rest positions that you can choose on the ground. And ultimately, every one of those rest positions is almost like its own mobility sequence and strengthening sequence for the joints, our mechanics, our biomechanics, how we stand, our posture, how we stand, how we walk, how we run, how we jump, how we balance, and how all of that looks in nature. The foundations of it is really the posture that is fed through ground sitting.
Yeah.
Right. So if we looked at, what are the sites that are compromised, and it's normally like the ankle should be a mobile joint, and then the knee becomes a stable joint. Then the hip becomes a mobile joint, and then our pelvis and our lower back becomes quite stable. And our mid back has amazing range, like flexion, extension, rotation. And then the neck needs to be quite stable, right? And it's like a joint by joint approach. But within that, there's victims and culprits, right? So I look at the chair will compromise the hip, right? So the hip becomes kind of the culprit, but it's also become a victim from the culprit being the chair, right? And then the hip, if the hips aren't mobile, then it's the lumbar and the pelvis that starts taking it. So the sites that should be stable suddenly start to get more movement in them. And what are the classics we're looking at in gyms now, right? The big plus word, or what I started out in Pilates, is all about core stability. Yeah, man, you've got to get really strong in the core. You've got to train the core, and you've got to do all these core exercises. But at the same time, the hips aren't functioning and the mid back isn't functioning because of the sitting posture, right? So it just makes you stronger at the core exercises, at symptom level, but you haven't gone to the core. So when you go back to your sitting and trying to move post-sitting, you're in exactly the same position you left off. And then the other entry point for me is footwear. So that's, I'm a barefoot endurance athlete. I've had a barefoot philosophy for a long, long time.
And I want to get into that too, because even the same thing. So when I was really injured and I was kind of stuck in my house for over a year just trying to heal, that's what got me off the couch and on the ground. And my hips were locked up, my feet were locked up, because it was just years of lifting really heavy, a bunch of crashes, a bunch of injuries, a bunch of surgeries. And then I noticed when I first got on the ground, it was really uncomfortable because of all these points in my body that were locked up and that were tight. And then, we have athletes always coming in and out of our house. And it's pretty interesting because most of the athletes are kind of similar. They naturally go from their gym session, from their training session, straight to the chair, and they're molding in to these positions, and their hips get tighter and tighter, tighter. Except for we have a lot of Japanese people who come and stay. And in school, they're taught to be on the ground, and they're taught these different sitting positions. And even their tables are lower, even their beds are lower. And coincidentally, their knees and their ankles and their hips work really, really well, and then once I got past the point where I can get outside and I could start exercising, so my knee exploded, cracked my femur up, and the doctors were saying I may never walk again without pain. And I just wanted to literally relearn how to walk. And I would go to these stairs, like a 15-minute bike ride away, and just practice walking up and down these stairs without pain. And it was a little bit after I seen another interview from you talking about taking off your shoes. And I was ultra careful because my knee was so sensitive that my shoes had extra padding, and the only time I wore these shoes was when I did this stair exercise on concrete because I thought it was protecting me. And then just one random day, I took my shoes off, I took my socks off, and my first set of walking up those stairs, like everything just seemed to click. Instead of chomping my feet down, I was stepping softer and more mindful. And I just became so much more aware of my movement. So instead of having to crunch down and look where I'm stepping, it's like my feet knew where they were because they could sense where they were stepping. So I could have that better posture coming up, and I could use all of my toes. And my feet got a little bit sore afterwards because I was exercising muscles that I haven't exercised in a long time. So again, thank you so much for introducing re-emphasizing this barefoot model to me. And I want to know a little bit more of why you do it, and, you know, more on this endurance barefoot athlete as well. Like, how far are you running barefoot and what is possible?
Yeah, well, I think in its origins, you know, I have a bit of a story, that backstory to where I grew up. So when I was born with congenital club foot. So my feet were really supinated. So if they were left, I'd be walking on the edges of my feet. You'd have club foot. The foot turns into a really supinated foot. So I was put into plaster cast, and then plaster cast boots for the first 12 weeks, every week, go and have it changed every week. Then put into boots with braces, and the braces then turning my feet out and then bolting them in positions. That's kind of my entry point, right? And then at 44, I start endurance, barefoot endurance running. There's quite some, you know, story in there, but it's, again, I think once I realized there was a specific posture in running that Nicholas has kind of alluded to and really highlighted, oh, wow, we were like trailblazing at that time in terms of, you know, the coaching. Most people before Born to Run, you know, were wearing compromising rubber footwear, right? I say compromising because anything above 3 millimeters of rubber is suggested it dumbs down the transient impact, where the signal comes to the brain and the brain can understand what shapes it makes, right? Due to the forces. So your physiological shapes will be governed by, am I going to get injured? How can I become more efficient? And make micro little adjustments in that system based on those models. But if you dumb it down with loads of rubber that blocks the signal, you start to make poor calculations and poor decisions within the physiology, which is where a lot of the niggles.
Because your brain just isn't getting the correct information to keep the posture correct.
You start loading areas of your feet that aren't even designed for load at certain pace. And the faster you go in running, let's say, the more increased the forces are. So ground reaction forces, like Newton's laws of opposites and equals, right? So let's say in standing, you have 1 times your body weight. We're sitting here now, it's 1 times our body weight. And when you walk, it's the same calculation. It's 1 times your body weight. Then when you run, it's suddenly 2 times your body weight in ground reaction forces. And when you sprint, there's 3 times your body weight. And this is where I mean, nature's such an intelligent design, but when you look at the foot and the way the foot behaves, and this is on like pressure plates, and they determine the behavior of the foot. So when people land on their heel, they have a heel rocker, and then you have an ankle rocker, which is the next phase where you're more flat-footed. So imagine it's like heel, or ankle, and then forefoot, 3 like rocking phases. So when you walk, you go heel, ankle, forefoot. But when you run, it's more ankle, forefoot. And when you sprint, more forefoot. So it's as if the foot will literally change its behavior, or we'll change the loading points of the foot due to the forces. And then within that foot, within the process of the foot, you have like up to 200,000 receptors in your feet that relay that information. You then have
200,000 receptors.
Yeah, same as your hands, right? Exactly the same sensory. And then you have...
so imagine like walking or going about your day wearing gloves or mittens all day.
With that much rubber and expecting to do stuff, right? And then you have 33 joints, 26 bones, and over 100 muscles, tendons, ligaments, like together as a calculation, right? So that is the foundation, right? So now we talked about the chair and how the chair will compromise the hip, right? So these have so many decisions to make, right? And if those decisions are off, of course, how the ankle behaves will be off, and how the knee behaves will be off, and how the hip will behave will be off. And you'll make either appropriate or inappropriate decisions based on that feedback, right? So what we discovered is that, you know, through running, for instance, there was Nicholas's amazing posture. And then when we started to get people back to being more minimal or barefoot, suddenly it was a game changer, because not only did they have the appropriate posture to deal with forces, they were getting the appropriate signals to maintain that shape, right? So over any terrain. Where it falls down for me, you know, going full loop on all this stuff, because it's about going into nature, is that most of the study was always done on linear surfaces, right? You know, in the zoo. So it's all linear, there's no variations or variables. And when you get out into nature, it's very different, you know, but the key is to basically get the appropriate shape and get the feedback through the feet, and the right mechanics, the right way of dealing with those forces while you're out there. And that's game changing. We were taking people, one instance, I had like a Danish running coach came to see me, and he had a school, like a running school, where he was coaching people through a model which was Arthur Lydiard's model. It's like coaching people into 100 miles a week. And everyone's getting injured. He's like, I don't understand why everyone's getting injured. I've got 22 injuries. Can I come and see you? So he winds up in my door in London, pop him up on a treadmill, record the guy. And basically his pattern was jogging, right? Jogging is like a modern phenomenon. It's somewhere between walking and running, and it's footwear that's allowed it. So what he started doing with his rubber, he started to load the heel more. And remember, the heel is more associated with walking. So suddenly the forces were redirecting somewhere else, and that's the knee, unfortunately, with heel striker, and he kept blowing his knee up. So the knee blew up, ITB, the runner's knee was kicking in, then lower back, and you could just chase all the segments of pain that were coming through down to loading. And it's not enough just to take his shoes off, right? I could just take his rubberized footwear off, but his shape hasn't changed. So that's where then the ground rest positions come in and rewilding a posture to get it back to what it would be doing naturally or with an observation of someone in nature. And then you have the barefoot and the posture, and suddenly it's a big game changer. I think within 6 weeks he was done. You know, no injuries,
6 weeks?
6 weeks, no injuries, back to running again. And it sounds, but the other thing that you're up against then, which happens with most runners, endurance, ultras, whatever, ultra athletes, is you have to kind of strip people back. And when it comes to technique, you have to get people back almost to understand their mileage again and build it and build it and build it. But the difference is you then have longevity, and you've been through injuries. You know what it's like to be out for a period of time. And there's other factors within that, like breathing techniques and other things that we can become much more of an endurance badass, really. And for me, that's become game changing. Like at the age of 44, I took on the challenge of running the whole length of the UK from the mainland, from the most southern point to the most northern point, which was 879 miles. And I did that barefoot. So that was a barefoot run.
So let me get this straight. You ran from the bottom of the UK to the top barefoot.
Yeah, the whole thing. And because
How long did that take you?
We did it I put it in as a 30-day challenge. I wanted to do 30 miles a day for 30 days. And then each, along the route, I was interviewing sustainability and environmental experts because some guy comes along and he's born with clubfoot, and he's going to run the length of the UK barefoot. It raises a lot of socially extreme eyebrows, and it gave us an opportunity to use that platform and just say, okay, let's get some press behind it. And through that, we raised some great funds for environmental organizations, but also it gave me an opportunity to get a podcast going while I was out there. So not only was I clocking up 30 miles a day, I was then getting the mics out and stuff like that along the route. So it was pretty, on hindsight, the interview stuff probably wasn't the best idea because you're like really, you're up against it as it is.
Yeah.
But there's some other stuff that happens there, like the stuff that was out of my control, variables are out of my control, but then other techniques that help that. So on day 26, I was getting across a stream and one of the rocks moved. My foot bedded down. I went almost like the bridge of the foot came forward. So I created an upper ankle sprain. And my foot was like, by the next evening, my ankle was just blown up. So I couldn't really stand on it. I had to take a day out. And then it was pure recovery work, like breath, ice, lots of mobility, trying to get back on the ground. Took a day out, and then that meant I had 47 miles to run after that. And then I had to finish on a 56 miler on the last day. And you've got this balloon ankle. I had to tape kind of the tibia fibula together to get out there. But again, technique came in. It was all about getting the feet off the ground and thinking about minimal loading. You were saying going up the stairs, and we because of footwear, it means that we've created 40 ways of moving around an environment. So if you observe kids, they're very, very light, right? Unless they're on the playground in the same amount of rubber as us, right?
Yeah.
Which would be the equivalent of us wearing that with our body size. But my kids are barefoot running around, and they're super light. And if you observe them, it's almost like they pull their feet off the steps. So they don't even load the step. It's like the foot's there, then they're focusing on pulling the next one up. And it means you get super light, and it's the same in running. You don't think about pushing off the ground. You've got to think about getting your feet off the ground. And then when you do that, it's super light. And so even with an upper ankle sprain, it changed things. But then it led me into the story of, is it natural to be running around on tarmac barefoot? And some of the stuff when you get to the north of England, it's really gnarly. It's like terrible stuff to even imagine running on. Whereas, you know, it's not like we're born, you know, we were in nature just running on grassy meadows and it being super soft. But it's not just a linear surface. Do you know what I mean? Like one plane, so you're always getting the same feedback. So it's the same pads. So the next event, you know, we were like, right, okay, let's have a look at what we can be doing. And there's a event here called the Three Peaks. And the Three Peaks is our highest mountains in the UK. They're not that massive here, but there's 3 mountains here. One is in Wales, one is in England, and one is in Scotland. And you would normally up and down the mountain, an ascent and descent, and then you drive between the mountains, and it's like 450 miles in between. Mm-hmm. And so it's normally a 24-hour challenge, and I was like, right, okay, I think I'm going to run it. You know, firstly, people are like, why don't you just do the 3 Peaks barefoot? Do that as a challenge. Like, well, it feels like it's been done. And I think let's have a look at maybe running the whole thing, and maybe I do the mountains then barefoot, and see what that terrain's like, actually running up and down mountains, the 3 tallest mountains here. And then in between them, I put Vivo Barefoot on, which is, you know, a shoe that enables you to, the foot to behave how it should, but it gives you just the protection. So that stops me from like wearing the pads of my feet out on tarmac on the same linear experience. And when we went further down the line, originally I was like, I'll do it in 10 days. And then someone said, well, you do know there's a record, right? There's a record. It's like 9 days, 44 minutes, and I think 18 minutes. 9 days, 44 and 18 or something like that. So, okay, let's we'll have a look at it. And there was a record. And so that became the obvious thing. Let's maybe put it down as a record. And then again, it raises those socially extreme eyebrows. This guy doing mountains barefoot. And for that one, I chose a real bigger picture cause, which is about raising awareness for Indigenous people and Indigenous tribes, because my work's always about looking at people in nature and observing natural behaviors. So it seemed fitting. And that was a very different experience, man. That was like running up and down mountains. The first mountain I did it in, I was up and down in under 2 hours. The camera crew were like, what the, you know, they had one guy settling up halfway, another one down, switching roles, and they just weren't expecting me to take it on that quickly. But other variables, again, like even if I was in shoes, it would have still happened. I tried to miss some people coming down, cracked a toe, had a broken toe on the first day, like in the first segment, and then had 2 marathons to run after that on that same day. So that was 3 mountains and 2 marathons a day for 9 days, that one.
No big adventure seems to go as smoothly as planned, does it?
It's always amazing. I was going out in training. It's like, I'd go out, it became so efficient with nasal breathing and technique. So I was literally going out and doing marathons before brekkie. Then I'd come back, you know, have food. I wasn't really drinking much because nasal breathing, you're not using as much water because the vapor's not lost through the mouth. It's like 42%. So
you were nasal breathing through all of it too?
Yeah. So then
it
just changes everything. And then, it train again, as you say, training's just, you know, you're on an event, there's so many variables in place. Like we were moving from place to place, like with my whole family. So we had 4 kids on the road with us in a camper, film crews, and various things happening because we had COVID going on. So most of the campsites or areas that we were looking to stay were closed, or you'd arrive and no, we're not happy about all of you staying. So you have that emotional kind of stuff going on in the background, which, you know, you have to be able to dismantle that, deconstruct that while you're out. And again, nasal breathing is like the bomb for that, because it just drops you into that really playful, meditative state when you're running. So,
and a lot of people don't really understand or really know about the benefits of nasal breathing. And that's something that I try to teach as many people as possible, is learning how to only breathe through your nose for most of the time. But at first it seems so difficult, but people don't realize, like, once you get a hang of it, then it literally makes everything easier. So for most people, that sounds crazy that you were running up mountains only breathing through your nose. But can you explain a little bit of how or why?
Why would
you only use your nose when you can breathe through your mouth?
Okay, so there's, again, I'll use like, because there's the indigenous stuff again. I think it's always important to look at what happens in nature, because otherwise we're always discussing stuff in the human zoo, and we very rarely look to, well, how does it actually look in nature? Because that's the only example. It's not a laboratory test, because that's still zoo humans in the zoo. It's even worse, it's laboratory humans in a laboratory, right? Let's actually have a look at people in nature. And the best studies on that are like Weston Price. So Weston Price was the, lauded dentist of the times, right? 20s, 30s, 40s, let's say. And he looked at all indigenous people when he was discovering that they had the most amazing jaw and teeth, right? And how is it, right? They're not using toothpaste, they don't have braces. But he also saw within certain communities how things were changing within their diet, right? And so within a very small window of time, through people being born into a tribe and introducing more processed food. And don't forget, processed, we're talking about way back, not processed like it is now. We're just talking about white flour and sugar, right? And white flour now is nowhere near what it was years ago. We're having to fortify white flour now to call it even flour, right? And so it was creating, what he discovered was inflammation. So mouth breathing is really a symptom, right? But what's the cause? And he was discovering that white flour and sugar was creating inflammation in the nasal passage. Therefore, it's forcing people to mouth breathe. And when they mouth breathe, it changes the mechanical structure, almost the physiological.
So inflammation through your nasal passage, is that like a stuffy nose?
Yeah, congestion, like an inflammatory nose. So again, you'll redirect the breath, right? So when they're redirecting the breath, it doesn't just mean your air intake changes. It means the physiological anatomical response to the breath has to change to support it, right?
It's much like putting rubber on your shoes. It changes the whole
so
all the way up.
Mechanics, what it's doing is they're showing that the jaw would sit back, they'd have a longer face. And so he was literally showing the face change in the jaw development change within tribes that would introduce more of a process. And remember, as I say, process is very different then, right? It would have still been organic, whereas now we have inorganic process, which has many other properties in it, right? So firstly is to understand that, because there's an Instagram phenomenon now of people taping up their mouths and showing themselves mouth breathing. But if you're not addressing what's causing the inflammation that's forcing you to mouth breathe in the first place, then it's a quick fix, but it's a further distraction of what the truth is, right? And the truth is, well, there's inflammation there. I don't think you should be taping up your mouth. I think you should deal with the inflammation and be taping up your mouth, right? Mm-hmm. And so I started to look at that model, and then you start to hear about like the miracle molecule, which is nitric oxide, which stimulated through nasal breathing, that is then stimulates bronchial dilation, vasodilation. So we get that lowering of blood pressure. We also get more efficient through absorbing oxygen within the lungs. Well, wow. For running, epic, right? They're what I want, right? Yeah. Then you start to look at the vapor. So through mouth breathing, it's 42% more water hydration is used through vapor, through mouth breathing, right? So then you think, right, okay, overhydration, I'm having to drink and drink and drink while I'm out there, right? Heart rate, blood pressure, aerobic, right? So all of those boxes were being ticked. Then the form, because you're in a tempo of breath, it enables us to remain down-regulated, because mouth breathing is associated with being up-regulated, like fight and flight, right? So you're then burning off other stores, right? So not only are you remaining in an aerobic state, it's much more down-regulated, you're much calmer. And then that enabled me to kind of find more meditation whilst I was out on a run. So originally I was doing 8-minute miles. And then when I took up nasal breathing, it meant I went to 10-minute miles. So very similar to the conversation back there earlier about the footwear, that when you have to start again, some people just don't want to hear it, but this is what changed for me. It went straight back to 8-minute miles. But those 8-minute miles meant all of a sudden I was much more efficient. My recovery was so much better. I could wake up or even go in the afternoon again and go and do another marathon. And I needed 2 marathons a day to be able to achieve that last event. So it just ticked all the boxes. And then when it comes to things like mountains, of course, you have to train in the habitat, in the environment. And I always use breath then as the pace. So running communities, from what I've coached, for fell runners, mountain runners, athletes, they're driven by certain external influences like heart rate monitors and all the gear, but have no idea, right? But we have to understand we're born with all the gear. We simply have no idea, and we need to relearn how to access it. Yeah, it's not like even indigenous tribes are thinking we have all the gear, we have all the idea. They just are being. And running is a process. If you get it and you refine it, it refines that understanding what it is to be a runner and to be running. And so for me,
it seems like a lot of the gear and tools that we have, from the heart rate monitors to the shoes to the couches, it makes things easier in the short term, but then it builds up all these compensations. Like even Wim Hof talks a lot about just the artificial lights and the air conditioning and the heat. It prevents our body from us knowing and learning or relearning how to regulate our own temperature, how to regulate our own breath, how to regulate our own heart rate. Because it's kind of like my friend Gary, who's actually on this chat, he gives me the hardest time because every time we go anywhere, I click on the GPS, because my generation is so, even if I drove somewhere 4 times already, I'll still click on the GPS because it tells me the traffic. And, I'm just so used to that. But his generation is from before the GPS. So he remembers how to get there almost immediately, just, from going there one time. And that reminds me of a lot of what you're talking about is, hey, when you're using a heart rate monitor, you disconnect yourself from your heart to understand how to feel your own heartbeat, or, from the artificial lights or the air conditioning, you weaken your own brain or body's ability to manage and to regulate itself.
Absolutely. If you think about, I use breath as the pace. So this is why I coach a lot of people. If you're pushing too hard, you'll have to mouth breathe. Look, it's a different application. If you're a sprinter, then it's a completely anaerobic thing. Some sprint, like 100 meters, you probably hold your breath, right? So,
in my sport, we train exactly like a 100-meter sprinter. So mouth breathing comes to play, but it's so rare where somebody is going to give 100% maximum effort, like they're fighting for their life. In our normal life, where we're just trying to go through our day calm, relaxed, smooth, centered, present, that's where the nose breathing comes. Because it seems like to me, as soon as we open our mouth, it's like pressing that gas pedal all the way down, and we're lowering our miles per gallon. And then as we learn how to breathe through our nose, or you guys probably don't call it miles per gallon, but in the car, you want to think of a very efficient car who can go further with less energy, right?
Well, but return back to being more hybrid, right? But it's again, the pace. So I would this isn't just applicable to runners. It's, it could be just walking in nature, walking to the shops. It could just be walking around your house. They're the areas that you really want to be putting nasal breathing to familiarize yourself with it anyway. But with runners, it's like, use the breath as the pace. If you're pushing too hard, use the breath to taper it down again until you can gain control again of nasal breathing. And then those minute miles will creep in anyway. The other thing is like using nasal breathing, not just within those realms, but is just even before dining. Because again, it's associated with being more of a calm state, more parasympathetic, which we know is rest and digest. If you're, a lot of the time you don't even realize we're upregulated or stressed. We just go, no, I'm fine. But if you rig people up to like heart math, they're incoherent, right? It's only when, if you take them through breathing practices or get them to down-regulate, then you can actually see, now I'm coherent, right? So sometimes we don't even realize. So I think nasal breathing just helps us get a handle on that.
It's hard to hear and observe what's going on in your environment when you're upregulated, and then
strip it back by 10%. I often have this saying, like, just drop the pace of everything you're doing by 10%. Every relationship will benefit from you being 10% slower and just getting things back to your nasal breath, right? Mm-hmm. Just very simple.
Exactly. Dude, that's pretty awesome. So what about just the average person who is sitting 8 to 10 hours a day, who's wearing the rubber shoes? Surely they're not going to take their shoes off, tape their mouth shut, throw away their couches and run up some mountains. There has to be somewhere to start for just the average person who maybe once they get out and start walking, but they're walking on big rubber shoes and their knees are starting to bother them just from walking around the neighborhood. What kind of stuff would you recommend as far as in lifestyle change?
things are changing right rapidly, because there's lots of studies coming in now, right, around, you know, walking in nature, for instance, right? So you can be immersed in nature for 20 minutes, and studies show that you get all the same responses that we're talking about with breath work, right? So you get lower heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol, just that sense of being improves, right? But no one's really talking about, well, what about walking naturally in nature? What would that be doing? Because if I'm walking in nature, but I'm walking in compromised footwear that's not signaling to my brain, which means I'm walking less efficiently, and I'm also increasing the risk of injury. Now, to my survival brain, when I think I'm going to get injured on a subconscious level, that's terrifying, right? So, you know, so we have to think, right, at least think posture. I think posture is the key here. So if you are sitting for your HADs are 10.5 hours a day, but in a chair, you have to have a kind of chair care in mind. It's like, well, set a timer. It can be 20, 25 minutes, whatever it is. Have the timer ding or a reminder of some sorts, and then you slide your chair out. You hold your desk, like on the edge of the desk, like that, with your hands on top. You keep your head up and your chest up, and you just squat down, but you allow your heels to come up. And when you're in that posture, you'll be more upright. So you'll be more like this. If you think about lifting your chest up like this and have your heels pop up, you can remain more upright. If you ask someone to squat with their heel down, not many people can now if they've been wearing compromising footwear and sitting in chairs, because the ankle can't cope. But if you allow the heel to pop up, then the hips can behave how they need to, and the knees can behave how they need to. And then you're away. That then reinforces posture. And I always recommend that before getting up and walking around. So if you sit, you'll be compromising certain areas that are designed to move, and you'll be compromising the areas that are meant to be stable. So if you reset it with a squat, it gets movement redirected in where we're meant to move, and it redirects stability where it's meant to be stable. Right?
So every 15 to 25 minutes, just get up, squat down, hit
squat, little bounce, stand up, squat, little bounce, and then walk off, and then come back to your desk. Another one is like, if you're working from home, most people are working from home now anyway, right? If you are in a home environment, put a pull-up bar in your door or somewhere like that. So you do a few squats at the table, you go to the bar, you hold the bar, you grip the bar, and you hang off the bar. So that enables us to lift that upper rib cage up again. There's other practices on the bar. You can be doing active arches, and then it creates extension and lower trapezius strength in the mid-back, which is necessary for us to remain upright, because we're all into, you know, we love a bit of mobility work, and we love the flexibility of the upper body and getting extension in, but we don't necessarily have the strength once it's mobile or flexible. And we want to get the strength back, and it comes from hanging. Hanging is a complete game changer, even for runners, right? It's surprising, you know.
Yeah.
So there are two little things you can be doing within your right. Now the other one is Netflix binging, right? Who loves a bit of Netflix binging? Oh, I love a bit of Netflix binging. So we have a rule which just like, well, if you want to put Netflix on, just take your practice to the ground. Yeah. Avoid the couch, because if you think of the compliant footwear that's rubber, right? This is fascinating around rubberized footwear. So the more compliant a surface, the more stiff you become. So if Will jumps up and down now on a really hard surface, what gives? Is it Will or the hard surface?
It's going to be the body. It's going to be the joint.
It has to be you, right? You have to become soft. And how do we do that? The muscles and tendons and the joint actions provide that elasticity and compliance. If you then get something rubberized and you jump up and down in it, you change the relationship or the signal of what muscles and tendons should be firing. So the floor becomes more compliant, and we actually stiffen a bit because the muscles and tendons don't understand the relationship. And that means then inappropriate shapes will come through it. If you get a couch and you find yourself like in these really compromised positions, but we're there for ages because we've just basically just disconnected from our whole physical body, you then stiffen in that shape again. And then we get up and we move around. So I would say get on the ground for most of your Netflix binges, whatever it is.
So if it's Netflix, football, soccer, sports.
Whatever your kind of, whatever that, you know, screen passion is, perhaps.
Yeah. If you're going to choose the TV, watch it on the ground.
And there's multiple rest positions, right? And there's no real good or bad here in the way you sit on the floor, because what happens when we are on the floor, we get signals. And those signals are, oh, this is about uncomfortable. So you'll want to change shape, then change shape and have a play with another shape. Yeah. Until you get the signal again, and then you'll change shape. And each one of those will keep nourishing the way the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip behaves. Now,
that's one thing that I noticed almost immediately is when you're on the couch, you can, or a chair, you could sit in the same position for hours. But when you're on the ground, you can't do that, you know? So if I'm sitting cross-legged, it's only going to be 15, 20 minutes until my body said, all right, move a little bit. So then I'm moving my legs this way, or I'm moving them this way. I'm moving them so it's keeping that blood flow. It's keeping that movement agile and continue to move instead of just sitting still the whole time.
Yeah, and just divorcing yourself, you know? It's about, you know, the idea is, imagine like if you kept moving on the ground and you kept moving how nature intended, as you age, you get stronger and more mobile. You don't, the idea is not to divorce yourself from your physical self. It's meant to be about refining and rewilding the experience, you know? I have like 72-year-old, well, someone that I started coaching at 72 is now 80. Right, 8 years I've been coaching this dude, and he first came like very much like you, Will. You wanted to learn how to walk again, right? And this guy was like, Tony, I need to learn how to walk. And he's like, imagine that, having that, being able to put the ego to one side at the age of 72 and say, I want to learn how to walk.
Yeah.
You know, and he was like head forward, completely, kyphotic in the mid back. And that guy now he's phenomenal. His commute looked a bit like this in the end, that he would wake up, put his Vivos on, walk to the tube. The tube is the underground train, right? And then you get on the tube, and then between stops, I'd ask him to squat. And then when the tube's going, I'd ask him to hang. So then he'd hang and squat, and then he'd mix that up with surfing. So no holding on, and you surf. So this is like
that's
someone
cool.
who was approaching 80 was doing that, you know, as a regular.
Yeah. And that kind of led me to my next question. So surely if you got to go somewhere, if you got to go to work, you can't go barefoot. You know, like it's not like you're going to show up to the office with, you know, toes a-flaring, you know, and what kind of shoes, you know, because I've actually bought a pair of Vivo barefoots. I know that you talk about them a lot. And, you know, I don't think you're sponsored by them. I'm not sponsored by them in any way. I'm not getting anything out of it. But I know there's an option, an in-between between barefoot and wearing shoes, right? Or what do you recommend for someone who's just trying to lessen that rubber below their feet?
Well, you know, like you were saying, that people aren't going to give up their chairs. Some people aren't going to give up their footwear. And I mean, I've had people that come in, it's like, yeah, but Tony, I can't give up these shoes for these things. And I said, well, this is the template to have when buying shoes in the future. Yeah, because those shoes are going to wear out at some stage. You're not going to keep the same shoes. So I get it. You like them now, but when it comes to it, you have to change them at some stage. Like the tires in your car, they need changing, right?
All right, I'm going to love this. A template to know when you're going to buy shoes. This is going to be good.
It's like, right, okay, you get your foot and you get a piece of paper and you put your foot on a piece of paper and you grab a black marker pen, you draw around your foot on the piece of paper, right? And you'll soon see that the widest part of the human foot is the toe box area, that area, right? And then the heel is the most narrow. So the heel is narrow, but the toe. So that's the shape of a shoe. If the footwear that you're looking at has a narrow toe box or more narrow than the heel, then you know something has to give there. And what will give is the 33 joints, 26 bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, and the 200,000 receptors in that foot. It has to change. And so will then the rest of the physiology will have to give to compensate. So it's use that as a template when you're going out. It's kind of like put your foot on top of the shoe. Yeah, and can I get my great toe, my big toe in that shoe? Some people will have shoe-shaped feet because they've been in footwear that's so narrow for time that instead of the big toe being here and there being a gap, the big toe comes in. So they then, and the issue
so common.
And the issue there is that because the great toe, the big toe, it's like 4 times denser and thicker than all the other toes. So we know it's designed for leverage and pivoting. And you know when I said about there's 3 rocking actions, you have a heel, an ankle, and a forefoot. Each one of those finishes on the forefoot. And the position in the forefoot where you go off the ground is through the mechanism of the great toe that's 4 times denser and thicker. If it's not available, instead of going there, we start to go there. Create supination and overpronation. And
that inside ankle bone low is what causes so much injuries, right?
Yeah, and then when you try and put any athletic sport through that, of course, the ankle, you're never going to be able to pivot properly. So that you put torsion in your knee because the ankle isn't available to it. And for most of the athletes I see, I mean, let's just not call it athletics, let's call it like martial arts yogis, right? Trying to put an Eastern ancient discipline through a Western compromised footwear wearing sitting posture. And the knee joint isn't available to them. The hip joint and the ankle joint isn't available to them. So most of the injuries I see around the knee again, through torsion injuries. And when you understand the evolution of the knee, and this is it, it's like the evolution of the knee is this. If you believe in the evolutionary model, right? Some don't, I get that, right? But if I believe in the evolutionary model, and let's say we were quadrupedal at some stage, and where can we observe that? We look to our closest cousins, the bonobo and the chimpanzee, and they can actually rotate their knee and they can grip, right? So we had this mechanism to rotate and offer torsion within the knee, but when we became bipedal, it's no longer appropriate to offer torsion in your knees. We needed to move in this direction. So we love flexion and extension. We just hate torsion. And so we developed tendons and ligaments to take that torsion or to deal with the torsion, to minimize torsion, let's call it, restriction of that. So we hate torsion, but again, if the ankle and the hip isn't available with amazing mobility, it's the knee that takes it. Every time it's like the middleman within it will take it.
Yeah. So we're getting close to time, but I want to end with just two strong questions. If you could give the average person who's never heard about much of any of this 3 things to do or to change in their life on a daily basis or weekly basis, what would those 3 things be?
Breath is like the first act of life and the last. Yeah. So refine your breathing. Reconnect.
By nose breathing or by some breath practice?
Reconnect breath. Go away and learn as many breathing modalities. There's almost as many breathing modalities as there are movement modalities, right?
Yep.
Just go away. This isn't about learning from gurus. It's about becoming almost your own breath guru. Go down that path of learning, because as I say, every relationship will benefit from it. So if you're I'm a papa to 4 kids, right? And my early template sometimes of my papa, and me being in my early years, I inherit sometimes of his language, like kids are meant to be seen, not heard, and all this stuff starts entering your head, right? And the house is chaos and it's nuts. And suddenly my dad's voice plays out. That's not me. It's not authentic Tony. So how do I get to find authentic Tony? Well, I need to learn to down regulate again. So I simply do this. Long inhale up through the nose and I extend the exhale. And by extending the exhale, you lower the heart rate and blood pressure. And by nasal breathing, you lower the heart rate and blood pressure. So it's just a way of very quickly down regulating. So let's say you've had a really stressful day. You've had a crazy commute. You arrive at your door. You're just about to enter the house. What's the best thing to do? Go in and carry all that chaos with you, or stop at the door. And that's around 10 seconds, around a 4-second inhale and a 6-second exhale. You don't have to count it, just lengthen it.
Yeah.
6 of those is 1 minute, Will. That's all it is. That's like 1 minute will literally change everyone's relationship around you and your own within yourself.
And that's a powerful minute.
Yeah, it's a powerful minute. Or stop and do 2 or 3 minutes, whatever it is. But understand that 6 cycles is literally a minute. That's it. And that's a game changer. The other one would be get on the ground and just, it doesn't mean, soaring up your furniture and just living on the ground like the Hadza. It just means understanding that every time you get to the ground, you'll further nourish that upright posture. That along with hanging, stuff like that. Think posture. Posture is the hierarchy. Refine the breath, refine the posture, because the posture will enable you to be much more open. You want to be an empowered being, right? We all want to be empowered beings. It doesn't mean wearing empowered being on your t-shirt. It means being, right? So that's about getting in the physiological vessel, right? The spiritual skin of it all. Then I'd start to think about organic consumption, That means everything you do, thinking organically. So that might mean your habitat of which you sleep, the food that you consume, the air that you breathe, the materials you put on your body. Start to, over time, and this is time, it's longevity, right? You don't have to do this all overnight, right? I'm planning on living till 100, right? So I've still got plenty of years left to refine it further. But for now, it's like inorganic consumption leads to inorganic beings and behavior, right? So try and get more organic with everything you do, the behavior and the being of you. So food consumption, try and get more organic. It might not mean you may not be able to afford to do it all organic, but go as organic as you can, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to redecorating your house, buy organic paints like clay paints. So you're not inhaling benzene, xylene, formaldehyde, all these weird things that can be coming through materials within your home. When you put a new carpet in, think again about the materials. When you buy bedding, think about the materials. Just bit by bit by bit, try and just make your life, your habitats more organic, because it will lead to more organic habits within the habitats.
Yeah. I read a really cool post from you just talking about consumption and waste. And that was actually my next question to ask you about how you adjust your consumption if you consume differently or just less. And it's really cool to see how differently you do consume. And that has been a big inspiration for me, because I'm always trying to consume less and to consume more, I guess, mindfully, but what about waste? It's crazy because it seems like, to my knowledge, humans are the only thing in nature that create waste.
Yeah, there's no term for it in nature, so you have to think like this, almost like that circular economy, really, don't you? That's what we have to start thinking about. So that's, we talked about brands like Footwear, like Vivo's a great example. Like, they're now going fully looking to regenerative circular economy. That's what they're looking to do. So the materials they're using can be straight back into the system. I've just bought more bedding for the house because we're in a bigger place now. And again, I'm buying materials that I know can go straight back into the earth,
Yeah, as opposed to, I think, the other side of that spectrum is, say, a one-time use plastic, or like a water bottle or plastic bag.
Yeah, again, it's tricky because there's unavoidable scenarios, right?
Yeah, it's so convenient just to buy a plastic bottle of water.
I think, just look in your, if it's avoidable, avoid it. But if it's unavoidable, don't beat yourself up. Because we're further down the line than we think, because we're discussing it, and generations before that weren't even able to have this kind of discussion. I mean, two dudes sitting down and discussing what we're discussing now.
Yeah.
I can't imagine my dad doing that, right?
Yeah, so especially across the world from each other.
Yeah, we're already way, way beyond where we probably imagined we would be. So I think it's just, there's a lot of greenwashing going on at the moment, but even the greenwashing, we understand now that companies are having to get on this right now. Yeah. Because if they're not, where are they going to be, right? So everyone's sitting around in those board meetings right now, trying to think how they can weave their more of a green wand over things that they're perhaps doing, which the consumer will be the one that drives that. So I think us as consumers drive markets. So if you at least think about with a more natural, organic lens, we'll change that.
Yeah, they're only making what we're buying,
Exactly.
And I think every dollar that we spend, that's really our voting process because they're, every time we buy plastic water bottles, they're going to create more plastic water bottles. Every time we buy a shoe that is regeneratively made and sustainably made, that gives that industry more power to make more of that and to advance their research and knowledge to even do more, which is a beautiful thing. And I think us as a species and as a planet, it's time for us to wake up and change, or else we're not going to be able to survive. We have to change the way that we're farming, the way that we're consuming, and the way that we're using products, or else we're not going to be here much longer. I think they're saying that we're in the middle of the 6th extinction, or one of the 6 greatest extinctions. And really what we do and what we change in the next now till 2030 or 2050 is going to determine if we're going to be able to participate in life after this extinction or not.
Well, I said that my last event was about raising awareness for Indigenous people around the world, right? So, the current wildlife statistics are that 4 to 5% of mammals on the planet are wild right now, right? The rest are either in a zoo or in a cage or in a farm, right? That's the reality of it.
That's crazy.
Yeah, but the same statistic is for Indigenous beings, right? Indigenous humans.
That's what I read, yeah.
And this is the nuts thing, though. So that wildlife and wild mammals and the biodiversity that we talk about and we so cherish and we love, but we're living in the zoo, right? Whereas the Indigenous people, 4 to 5% of the human population that are Indigenous look after 80% of the world's biodiversity. That's what we really need to be looking at protecting. Like the conversation around plastic bottles, it's great, it's amazing, but on that scale, there's a much bigger conversation. You know, it's like that's where we need to all be directing, because I'm into natural living, natural ways of living, natural parenting, looking at nature the whole time. But where is that example if we remove all the natural indigenous people from the indigenous natural habitats? And what would happen to the biodiversity that they are custodians and looking
Well,
after?
since you brought that up, I know it's usually an hour. If you got time, I'd love to dive into just biodiversity, because that's one of just the most important words to me, is biodiversity. And not just to me, but I think us as a species and as a planet is, why is biodiversity important? And why is that something that we need to be thinking about? What is biodiversity?
It's almost like looking at, on any scale, you can discuss like things like trophic cascade, where we look at diversity on that level, right? So if you were to say, right, Yellowstone Park, they introduced wolves into the habitat, right? And what happened in the habitat, right? Suddenly the whole environment landscape changed by having wolves within it, because other could be deer, it could be another number of species get out of control, the numbers get out of control, right? And that then changes the landscape and can literally wreak havoc on a landscape, right? Then what we see is when the landscape changes, that means insect populations change, right? Not just the mammals that probably exist in there, but we're looking at on every level, the diversity of that area will change. There's a space where I recently visited, which is called Broughton Hall. It's like a 3,000 acre estate. It's been in this guy's family since 1066, which is like William the Conqueror. 33 generations have lived there. And he classed himself as the custodian, not really the owner, right? So just this custodian, And so he's rewilding the land. So he's rewilding 1,000 acres of that 3,000 acre estate, which he's reforesting. And you think about that as a message. This guy's not really going to get to sit under those trees, right? Because it's an ongoing project. And that's what we need to understand about. We're rewilding areas that possibly we won't even get to see. It's about the next generations. And what happens when you rewild those areas, the diversity as in the species change, right? You introduce more and more wild species to the environment. They're drawn to it, which changes everything. The fauna, everything will change within that landscape. It's not just about planting trees. It's about changing the whole landscape.
And that builds strength and health in nature and in ourselves as well.
Yeah, and then we get into soils, right? So biodiversity, you could be talking about biodiverse soils, right? What's in the soil? And they say that, right, one handful of soil, like real rich soil, there's more microbials in that soil than ever has been the number of humans on the planet, right? And then when we understand like fungal networks and microbials, so that if you go into a natural forest, it's abundant there. And then if we look at what's maybe been farmed since that, in conversation with Weston Price and the processed flour at that time, what is it like now? And that's been grown over and over again, and what's depleted through that soil. There isn't much abundance in there, and it's that the plants then have a conversation with the soils to give us the nutrients that we perhaps need, right? And that's understanding biodiversity on a completely different scale, right? Down to the soils, the plants, the animals that feed off the plants, and so on. And the more diverse that they suggest for the human being, at least, the better the emotional outcome. So if we all decided that 20-minute study of heart rate, blood pressure will drop being in nature, it depends on the nature. Like going to a park that's been mown and is engineered in a way isn't going to give you the same emotional sense of well-being as it would in a forest with terpenes and natural aromatherapy and biodiverse soil.
Yeah, for sure. And food and diet is really a lot of the same thing. Is we want to be searching for the diversity in the plants that we eat and the foods that we eat. If we're eating the same 3 plants or same 3 vegetables, your body gets, it wants something else. But if we have a nice diverse array of different fruits and vegetables and plants that we're eating, it protects a different system. It protects us from a different intruder. And there's so many different things. In the same way that if you had a football team, if every player on that football team was good at the same thing, it wouldn't be a good team. You need a quarterback, you need a running back, you need somebody to play defense. And that's one of, in my mind, I guess, the simplest ways to explain why diversity and biodiversity is important. If you have a bunch of friends that are from the same neighborhood and all your friends are from the same neighborhood and seen the same experiences, you haven't really gotten outside that neighborhood. But if you have friends from all over the world, from England, from Japan, from South America, just that biodiversity of friendships expands your own mind and helps you live such a broader perspective.
Yeah, well, think of it like interdependence, right?
Yeah.
It's like almost allowing everything to have its own unique, what the universe has uniquely assigned it to be.
Yeah.
And keep nourishing that, right? And if we talk about, again, the plants, it's like, yeah, you could have a huge array of plants, but then say that's in the human zoo soil versus the huge array of plants that have been just left in amazing in soils, right? Biodiverse soils.
Yeah.
The conversation I had with this Abby Rose, she's like an amazing soil expert. So you think of plants, right? And plants have a communication with the soil through photosynthesis. They lay down sugars, and the soils give the plants what they need, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's an incredible system, right?
Beautiful.
So
yeah.
That's the harmonious relationship of that. So where do humans play in that? There's a woman that I also interviewed called Isabella Tree, and they've rewilded their estate. And they've introduced species back there, like they have these longhorn cows, and she will discuss like if you were to prune a bush, like basic horticulture, you prune a bush so it will grow back thicker. Whereas an animal will come along and it will graze on the bush with its saliva, and suddenly the bush grows back at a much more rapid rate. Now, is it, Will, that we're so disconnected we don't realize that perhaps the saliva from the animal, the bush, and the sugars that the bush lays down into the soil is all one communication?
Yeah.
And what have we lost of a human being by disconnecting ourselves from that whole biodiverse system, as in us being part of it rather than outside of it?
Exactly. We literally disconnected ourselves out of nature, not just physically, but if you look, like, it blew my mind in the past month. I looked up the definition of nature, and the definition of nature said something that was pretty much everything besides us.
Yeah.
And and which was crazy to me, because like I always thought I was part of nature, and like we're all just this one thing, kind of like a soup. And then us as humans are literally disconnecting ourselves from nature. And I think that's a lot of the issues that we're having mentally, physically, because we're thinking so much of an individual instead of the collection.
100%. I have this nature's way of almost punishing us for the bad skill or the disconnection from us being nature is what we could say is injury, disease, depression, mental health issues, right?
Yeah, because when we're in alignment, those don't seem to show up.
This is the trip on that, because really it's not nature's way of punishing us, because in theory we are nature. So we are literally punishing ourselves, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Living outside of that realm.
It's kind of like for the people who are constantly thinking in like hate or anger or revenge, it's like they're creating their own poison, that kind of poisons their own mind and poisons themselves. And that's kind of what we're doing, of looking for that quick fix and not thinking that nature is just there for us to take advantage of, is why we're really hurting our own self. Because when we run out of water, we run out of water. So like the better we take care of our nature and our environment and our ecosystem, the better we're taking care of ourselves.
And to actually even just take it on the responsibility on that you are nature. It's just, I am nature. Everything I do outside of this, if it hurts, that hurts me.
Yeah, exactly. We are nature.
You're growing your own stuff, right? You've got your own little biodynamic kind of system going on now, right?
Yeah. So in our whole front and backyard, we created a complete permaculture food forest landscape. So it's kind of like rewilding, but in our own kind of way. Like we just built the soil and planted a bunch of plants that benefit us and benefit our local ecosystem. And living in Florida, we have great weather to grow almost anything. Just our soils are just pure sand. So we just mulched and wood chipped from all the local trees and planted things like avocados, mangoes, bananas, star fruit, haranga, just bunches of biodiversity, and this brought in birds, butterflies, lizards. And like it created its own beautiful ecosystem to where we're not only benefiting from the organic, high quality food. Really the highest quality food that we can get a hold of is the food that we're growing in our backyard, but it's also feeding the ecosystem. It's feeding the local ecosystem. It's inviting birds, it's inviting butterflies, and it's bringing flowers, which, who doesn't love flowers and butterflies, right? Yeah. Hey, so one more question, and I actually got this from David, one of our live listeners.
Hey, David.
He said, I've been told that I have the beginning symptoms of neuropathy. How would a barefoot lifestyle help me with that situation?
Neuropathy. Yeah, I would, again, it's what you need to be able to understand is to be able to get the feet back to that mind-body loop. It needs to be a mind-body loop. How do you keep reconnecting with that? So how do you allow the mind to connect with the physiology? And so I would go down the path of, there's a practice I call toga, which is about rewilding feet. So there's certain toe practices or feet practices that will just help nurture and open up the joints and the knuckles of the feet, which then ultimately will change how the mind-body loop will respond. So it's not just about going barefoot. In fact, it's probably not always the best thing to go barefoot immediately, because the shape of the foot is possibly compromised between the first and second toes, right? So it's about allowing the foot to open up, and then of course you increase that response through mind body. I'll put some I'll send it over. I don't know whether you're going to do show notes or anything like that. I'll send some links over, and we can put some toga in there and some practices for the guys to have a little play with.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. And this is going to be put on YouTube on the Chat with Will Grant playlist. And I will put all of those notes that he's referring to right in the description below, as well as with some awesome other.
So again, I wouldn't just go think barefoot. It's about rewilding the foot and getting the foot back to its shape and performance, and then the mind as well and the body in that same context,
Yeah. And it's an incremental
practices. I'll send you those. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's an incremental process for sure. I remember when I first took my shoes off and started to become aware of this, my toe was all the way inside of my pinky toe. Like it was all crunched up in a million and one bad different ways. And just by laying down on the ground and literally just trying to put my mind towards my feet to open those toes and then crunch them up, open those toes and crunch them up. And it took, I'm sure Tony probably has quicker ways, but it took me 6 months to really be able to even move my toes. And then I started putting my fingers in between toes, which has helped me so much. Is just, I'll show you a quick little example of every night, before bed, I would just put my fingers in between my toes, and that helped release almost all of that tension to spread those toes apart. And what was crazy was when I spread my toes apart and it released my feet, it really felt like it released my knee, and it was releasing my hip, because it's all connected. And so those are the few things that I've done, and we're going to leave those notes in the description or below that you can check out Tony's prescriptions too.
There we go. You can have a play with that. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tony, dude. This has been an awesome conversation. I didn't even want to let it go, brother. And I really appreciate you taking the time. And
thanks for having me on, man. It's been great. It's been awesome. Good to see your face again, man.
Yeah, man. It's good to see you too. I'm sure we're going to connect again in some way or another.
It will happen. It will happen. Maybe at some stage when things really open up, we might even do something in person one day, man.
Yeah, that would be pretty epic, brother.
Well, stuff, man.
See you again later, man.